organic fertilizers that weren't. How millions of tons of organic produce were affected by years of fraud in the fertilizer industry. When I first started researching food fraud in 2015, I realized there were serious vulnerabilities in the organic food supply chain of the USA. The problems seemed obvious to me and an outsider, but weren't being talked about in any public forums. They stemmed from the requirements to feed animals raised for organic meat exclusively on non-GMO, that's not genetically modified, feed, combined with a serious undersupply of non-GMO corn and soy in the US. Although we didn't know it at the time, there were a number of fraudsters taking advantage of those vulnerabilities, with a series of major frauds in which conventionally grown corn and soy were misrepresented as organic and diverted into the organic supply chain. Many such frauds only came to light years after the fact. Check out issue 14, issue 116, and issue 131 for examples. Now I've learned about another type of fraud that was happening at around the same time, and which was also designed to benefit from the growing demand for organic food. It's large-scale fertilizer fraud, and it was perpetrated on hundreds of organic farmers over multiple years by at least 2 business owners. One man, the owner of California Liquid Fertilizer, CLF, started out with a legitimate organic product. He fermented fish bycatch in large tanks, turning the resulting slurry into organic, suitable fertilizer to be delivered through irrigation tubes onto organic crops. The problem with delivering fish slurry through irrigation tubes is that it blocks the holes in the tubes, disrupting water flow. When CLF began to struggle financially, its owner started breaking the organic rules by adding an ingredient that's banned under organic fertilizer guidelines to one of his products. The aim was to increase its nitrogen content to make it more effective and more attractive to farmers. The banned material was derived from soybean processing waste and contained ammonium chloride. Unfortunately, as well as being an unimproved ingredient in organic fertilizers, the ammonium chloride damaged his customers' crops, further hurting his business. He switched to a different ingredient, also not organic approved. It was another soybean waste product derived from lysine production and contained ammonium sulfate. This material was already sold by the lysine producer as a liquid fertilizer for conventional, that is not organic, farming. And a reminder, ammonium compounds contain nitrogen. The second ingredient worked well in the fish slurry product. Farmers loved its high nitrogen content, and it didn't clog the irrigation tubes as much as other organic liquid fertilizers. In fact, it was so good that the manufacturer soon abandoned fish fermentation. The neat ammonium sulfate liquid was simply packed straight into containers labelled as organic fish meal-based fertilizer, called Fertilizer XN. The product was a roaring success and soon accounted for almost 1/3 of the Californian fertilizer market. Millions of gallons were sold, including to some of the country's biggest organic producers. Says Ag Web of the Wonder product, everyone in the industry knew a fish crud fertilizer at a minimum of 6% nitrogen could never flow properly through deep irrigation systems, but Fertilizer XN did. As well as being wildly successful for growing crops, the new formulation was much cheaper to make. The lysine waste, which contained ammonium sulfate, cost just 5% of the price of the fish meal, which was supposed to be the main source of nitrogen in the product. Brian Baker, who worked at an organisation responsible for the organic status of agricultural inputs like fertilizer, the Organic Materials Review Institute, OMRI, during the time of the fraud, says the fraud was easy to hide. The plant manager at one Fertilizer XN production site later told the FBI that he knew its only ingredient was a brown liquid called XN, but didn't know what that was. XN was ammonium sulfate, shipped directly from the lysine manufacturer and pumped straight into the fermentation tanks. No fish meal or other ingredients were added. Baker inspected CLF's production facilities and saw rail cars full of ammonium sulfate being pumped into fermentation tanks. But when he questioned its use, was told those tanks were for the production of conventional fertilizers. He told AgWeb that there was no analytical test that could definitively prove the source of the nitrogen in the organic fertilizer, and that it was unlikely laboratory test results would hold up in court. He also believed that CLF's owner, who was the qualified microbiologist, was sometimes using fish meal to pass laboratory tests, adding enough fish solubles to make the results of stable isotope tests appear plausible. CLF wasn't the only business selling fraud-affected fertilizer. At around the same time, from 2003 to 2008, another business owner was perpetrating a similar fraud with his organic fertilizers. He was also buying unapproved materials, including aqueous ammonia, ammonium sulfate, and urea, and using them in his range of liquid organic fertilizers. He perpetrated his fraud with the help of a 1 million gallon tank hidden in a neighbouring property. When inspectors visited the fertilizer manufacturing site, the fence between it and the neighbouring property was in place. But when the inspectors left, the fence was moved, pumps and hoses were pulled out of hiding, and the synthetic ingredients were pumped into product tanks where the organic products were made. The hidden tank was kept secret from officials in the organic supply chain, like Omri, but the company's use of aqueous ammonia was known to at least one other agency. A local government agency actually fined the company $18,000 over failures to store and handle the chemical safely. Like his counterpart at CLF, the owner of this second business had great success with his artificially boosted products. His products made more than $40 million in 6 years. The frauds were eventually revealed. In 2004, an employee of CLF sent a letter to the California Department of Food and Agriculture, CDFA, saying the company was using ammonium sulfate in its organic products. Investigators from the CDFA performed a mass balance to compare the quantities of ingredients purchased by the business with amounts that were supposed to be used in its conventional and organic products. They couldn't account for the tons of ammonium sulfate that had been purchased by CLF and obtained evidence that the ingredient XN in BioLyser XN was the same as the ammonium sulfate sold by the lysine producer. However, if this was enough to prove fraud at CLF, the wheels of justice turned slowly. Production of tainted fertilizer, which is thought to have begun around 2000, stopped in 2006, but the owner of CLF wasn't arrested until 2010, more than 6 years after the CDFA first learned about the fraud. He pled guilty to 2 counts of mail fraud over 4 statements made on the Omri annual renewal forms stating there had been no changes to the formulation of his organic fertilizers. The second man, the one with the hidden tank, was indicted in 2011 and pleaded guilty to 4 counts of mail fraud. Both men received prison sentences and financial penalties. It's believed that other fertilizer companies were doing the same thing at the same time, but were never charged. Baker told AgWeb they felt compelled to do so because it was impossible to compete with the market-leading fraudulent fertilizers unless they also used synthetic nitrogen sources in their products. Baker also claims that buyers and agronomists knew the CLF fertilizer was not made from fish meal because it didn't clog their irrigation tubes. With huge quantities of inauthentic fertilizers being used by so many growers for so many years, the long-term impact on organic production should have been catastrophic. Under the National Organic Program rules, says AgWeb, the USDA should have made every organic farmer that had used the tainted fertilizers let their fields lie fallow for 3 years, but they did no such thing. By the time the accusations became public, more than 3 years had passed since the fraud had ceased. Perhaps that was why the teams which investigated these crimes waited for so long before they acted against the perpetrators. We don't know. No farmers lost their organic certifications, and no one, apart from the 2 business owners in this story, was ever caught or punished. Is fraud like this still happening today? Perhaps. Where there is demand for high-performance agricultural inputs and cheap ways to deliver such performance, there's motivation for people to break the rules. And all it takes is for their customers to turn a blind eye to products which seem too good to be true. Says Baker, the lesson here is to stay awake to fraud in any type of agriculture. Will something like this happen again? Sure could. In short, an article published in AgWeb Journal describes large-scale fraud perpetrated by at least 2 suppliers of organic fertilizer in the US in the early 2000s. The frauds involve the use of synthetic ammonium compounds to boost the nitrogen content of the fertilizer in contravention of organic rules. Authorities did not act against the perpetrators until years after the frauds had stopped. Many organic farmers who'd used the tainted fertilizers did not need to withdraw products, lose their certifications, or halt production. Frauds like this could happen again. And the main source for everything I've just said is an article by Chris Bennett published in AgWeb Journal called Organic Implosion, How Two Grifters Cooked $50 Million in Fake Fertilizer and Rocked Agriculture.